Hey guys, it's Timothy here. It's been a while. I've been out of town for a while doing some things over my summer vacation, but I'm back and I am here to go ahead and go over my set reviews for Hour of Devastation. A couple things to keep in mind about these set reviews that they're focused on limited, specifically draft, even though a lot of what you mention in draft translates over to sealed and vice versa. But we are looking at this for draft. So if a card really stands out for constructed, that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm just looking to kind of place cards in my mind as far as like when I would pick them in a draft and how well I think they'll play. I do have a rating scale. It's the same rating scale I used last time I did one of these reviews, so we'll look over that in a minute. And we are going to do this in Wooborg color order, so we're going to start off with the white cards. Keep in mind this is a small set, so we don't have as much to go through. But yeah, these are all my opinions. This is being recorded after pre-release, but before actual release day weekend. It has been released online, so you can draft this set right now if you wanted to, and it's really fun. But we're going to go ahead and run into this now, and we're going to look at the rating scale that I use. Remember that I grade these on a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being just complete garbage cards that you don't want in your deck, and 10 being the best of the best, just the absolute bombiest cards you can think of. A 0 is completely unplayable. A 1 is kind of an odd grade because it means it's a sideboard card you don't want to put in your main deck, and therefore if you do put in your main deck, it probably won't play very well. But the grade goes up after you sideboard it in. Usually sideboard cards go up to like a 6 plus or something like that after you sideboard them in when you know they're good, rather than putting them in the main board. 2 are cards that I don't want in my deck, but there are very specific archetypes that they fit. Maybe you need a finisher, and it's the type of card that will fit that role if you can't find something else. Or it's just a very niche kind of card. 3 are weak filler cards. These are cards I generally warn people against playing, and they're the type of cards I expect to go last in a pack. 4 is also kind of a weird grade. I kind of reserve it for archetypal cards, cards that only fit in specific kinds of decks. And they're usually good in those decks, but if you put them in the average deck, they'll do their job, just not as well. 5s are where you're going to see the meat of your cards. A lot of cards are 5s just because, you know, they're not great, but they're not terrible either. You'll play them, but you're not really looking for them highly. Everything 6 and above is kind of where I look for cards that I think are good. A 6 is a low priority playable, a card that you're happy to have, but you're not picking highly, whereas a 7 is a card that you're happy to have, and you probably will pick highly. We're talking like maybe picks 2 through 5 or something like that, whereas 6 are the type of cards that you're happy to get between like 6 and 8 or something like that, or the cards that you're really happy to wheel if they're 2 playable cards in a pack. 8, 9, and 10 are just your good cards. 8 are cards that aren't necessarily bombs, but I'm happy to first pick. You'll see uncommons here a lot. They don't quite reach bomb territory, but good removal spells and stuff like that qualify as an 8. 9s are just cards that you're always going to pick. They're going to be bombs. They're going to end games a good number of times. They're going to win combat or do something along those lines and make life very difficult for your opponent, but they don't protect themselves or they're easy to kill or something along those lines. And then your 10s, which we won't see any in this video. Spoiler alert, no 10s for white. 10s are just insane. And there are some 10s in this set, just not in white as far as I'm concerned. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and skip over the 0s because thankfully there aren't any cards that I consider completely unplayable in white. There are in other colors, don't worry, we'll get to them. But in white, not that many. And we're going to go and start with our 1 sideboard cards. There are a couple here. And yeah, you can main deck these cards, but I'm not super excited about it. The first one's actually a rare. It's Oketra's Last Mercy. This is a sorcery for 1 in double white. It is a rare, and your life total becomes equal to your starting life total, but your lands don't untap during your next untap step. So what this means is you go back up to 20 life, but you basically skip your next turn. This is a 3-drop, but hopefully you never have to play it on turn 3, so realistically you can keep other lands up. And we're going to see a cycle of rares that are just like this card, where you get some sort of powerful effect for really cheaply, but your lands don't untap. It's kind of inspired by Exerting, where something doesn't untap in exchange for something really powerful. But I think Oketra's Last Mercy is just not what you want in your deck. Out of this cycle, out of the last action cycle, or whatever you want to call it, the Last Mercy is the only one that doesn't give you any sort of advantage on board. If you're really far behind, you are still going to be behind after you cast this, and it shouldn't be too hard for your opponent to just kind of make up that life gain that you just got. You basically give them 2 free turns of attacking you. The turn following this, and then the turn after you not untapping. So you got to be really careful when you play this. And even though it could gain you like 19 life or something along those lines, it might not save you. I think it's playable out of the sideboard if you're against a very hyper aggressive deck. Sometimes you just need to stabilize, but you're at a really low life total. And this could save you, even though taking a turn off is a little bit risky. So I recommend keeping it in the sideboard until you know for a fact you need to board it in, because there are times you're just not going to cast this at all if you're ahead, and then there are times that when you cast it, you'll still lose the game. It reminds me of Providence from Eldritch Moon, which was a 7 mana, basically set your life total to 26, but just didn't play that well. A lot of times you would cast it and you would still lose the game because you just wasted an entire turn. You gave your opponent a whole turn of being able to get ahead of you, and the life gain didn't really matter there. You're going to see this again in the green set review, but pure life gain spells just don't do the trick in limited, and while I do think this has some sideboard applications, I'm recommending leaving it in the sideboard. Next card up, Gideon's Defeat. This is another cycle of cards, the Planeswalker Defeat cycles. They're very, very powerful hate cards against their own color. So, for instance, Gideon's Defeat is good against white creatures. They also have some Planeswalker text that mostly won't be relevant, but the problem is they only work against that color. So, for instance, Gideon's Defeat is 1 white, and that's it. For an instant that says exile target white creature that's attacking or blocking. If it was a Gideon Planeswalker, you gain 5 life. So we could ignore that last text. There is a Gideon in Amonkhet, but you're not going to face it very often. Yeah, you have to be some very specific conditions to actually have this against a Gideon, but so what, right? And 5 life's not even really a huge deal. Now, this is pretty crazy against a white creature deck, though. Being able to exile an attacker or blocker for just 1 white mana is pretty crazy. Kind of like Time to Reflect, but less restrictions on it, ironically. My opinion on the defeat cycles is that you don't want to pick them highly, but you're happy to have them in your deck if you are that color. So, for instance, if I'm playing white, I'm not going to first or second pick a Gideon's Defeat, but hopefully it'll wheel. And I think these cards should wheel pretty often, the defeat cycle. The reason I say that is if there's somebody in the table at white, and let's say there's one other white drafter, are you really going to take a powerful sideboard card for specific matchups over, a good main deck card? Probably not, which means that the defeats will very likely wheel a good number of times. So if you want to get a defeat or you see it in an opening pack, you can kind of hope for it to come back. And it might not. If there are no other good white cards in the pack, then the other white player is going to take it. But I don't know. I think all of these defeats are going to be sideboard only, but when you bring them in, they're going to be exceptionally good. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say about the defeats. Don't draft them highly, but if you do get a chance to take them late in a pack, go ahead and take them. It is interesting whether or not you would splash in a deck that can support, adding a different color, whether or not you would sideboard in a card like this. Like maybe I was red-green with a lot of ways to splash, and I brought in 1 Plains and a Gideon's Defeat out of the sideboard against white decks. That's something I would consider, but we'll see how the format plays out until then. Last sideboard card I want to mention, one that was kind of made for Constructed, you can tell, is Solemnity. 2 and a white for an enchantment. It is a rare, and it says players can't get counters, and counters can't be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. So, take that as foretold. I don't know. The players can't get counters thing doesn't really matter for the purposes of Amonkhet and Hour of Devastation. It's like an energy counter thing or an infect counter thing, or I guess experience counters for Commander. What this does do in Limited is stop -1/-1 counters, and it's kind of odd because you might bring this in against decks that are really heavy in -1/-1 counters. Like this shuts down removal spells like Splendid Agony and what's the other one? Torment of Venom. And it really stops them from working. But the problem with bringing this in against those decks is that the same decks that play cards like Splendid Agony also play these big creatures that get -1/-1 counters as a drawback. And if you play Solemnity trying to hose their removal spells, you might just pump up their creatures. Imagine playing Solemnity and then your opponent plays Amit Eternal. Suddenly that creature can't get -1/-1 counters anymore, and it's just a permanent 5/5 afflict 3 for 3. You just completely bolstered your opponent's game plan trying to shut down some other part of it. So I'm not a big fan of it. I actually don't even suggest bringing Solemnity in at all against these sorts of decks. I think just leave it in the sideboard or don't draft it at all for that matter. And I can't really see too many scenarios where I want it. It does do a couple other cute things like stop and brick counters and so on and so forth, but it's not really worth it. I wouldn't go out of my way to pick this card, and I definitely wouldn't even board it in, even in the matchups where you think it might be good. Moving on to our narrow role players, our twos. These are cards I don't want in my deck, but you have to have a very specific kind of deck where it might work or it might fill a certain role. First one, God Pharaohs Faithful. This is an 0/4 for 1 white. Human Wizard, it's common. Whenever you cast a blue, black, or red spell, you gain a life. Whatever. Yeah, it has some life gain attached to it, but you have to be like anything but white, green. I don't know. It's really weird. And you have to have majority of that color for this to really be that useful. Like if you're a pretty much white-based deck with a couple black cards, then this is just even worse than it looks. Here's my problem. 0/4s are not going to cut it. You know, they print these cards all the time, and they're like not even good in a normal set. 0/4s just don't do anything. They block. That's what they're there for. But if you bring them in against aggressive decks are going to find a way to get over it or around it. That's what aggressive decks do. So 0/4s are not super crazy at doing what they're supposed to do. They're especially bad in Hour of Devastation and Amonkhet for 2 reasons. First off, the exert creatures usually get big enough that they can just run these things over, and being a 0/4 means that they're never going to block profitably. They're just going to die at some point, and probably very, very early as far as this format's concerned. The second thing that makes these really bad is Afflict, the new mechanic that we'll see when we start looking at, I think, black, maybe blue-red, whichever one comes first. Afflict punishes you for blocking. It says if you block an Afflict creature, you take a certain amount of damage anyway. It's kind of like a pseudo-trample ability, right? If a creature has Afflict 2 and your only defense against that is God Pharaohs Faithful, you're still going to be taking damage even though you have this blocker against their aggro card. And I really can't justify telling people to play these defender-type creatures. There are a couple in this format. There's like 3 or 4 0/4s in this set that I imagine we're here to try to slow the format down, but I think they're just going to get run over. Still, I think I might sideboard this in against a deck with a ton of like 1/1s and 2/2s and stuff like that that really want to be attacking. But my suggestion is don't draft this card in the first place. I know a lot of people really love these sorts of cards. They think it's going to save them against an aggro deck, but I have to imagine that's not the case for Hour of Devastation, and my suggestion is don't play this card. Next one, complete opposite spectrum. Overwhelming Splendor is a mythic rare. It's 6 and double white, 8 mana total for a curse. The enchanted player's creatures enchanted player controls lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 1/1. And enchanted player can't activate abilities that aren't mana abilities or loyalty abilities. So this is pretty crazy, right? But it's 8 mana. So we're at odds with a super, super powerful effect and an exceptionally high mana cost. Now, this is humility, right? It turns all of your opponent's creatures into 1/1s with no abilities, basically. They're just 1/1s. They're tokens for all that matters. And this is going to let you run them over very, very easily. Nothing they play is really going to matter. ETB effects don't do anything. They can't use activated abilities. It even shuts off their non-planeswalker activated abilities, things like Edifice of Authority and so on and so forth. They just don't do anything. And after you play this, you should be able to get an easy win, right? Now, the problem is it's 8 mana. And when we think of 8 mana, we might look at Sandworm Convergence. You're going to hear me mention this card a lot as a comparison to some of the other expensive kind of win con type cards in Hour of Devastation. And the reason I say that is because Sandworm Convergence is a good example of 8 mana spent well that can win the game. It has a built-in win condition by making a 5/5 every turn, and it stops flyers, which means you've got an extra line of defense, and it just takes over a game. But I think the huge appeal of Sandworm Convergence is that it's green. And green has a lot of ramp effect, even more in Hour of Devastation. Overwhelming Splendor is white, and white decks are pretty much aggro. Like, half the cards you're going to see here are aggro cards, and it doesn't really support the game plan of waiting and stalling in a control deck till you get to 8 mana to play this card. And then there are even those times where you play this, and then your opponent just has enough creatures that they kill you with a bunch of 1/1s anyway, and that's just embarrassing, right? So I think you can build a deck where Overwhelming Splendor is good, but I don't know what kind of deck that is. It's a very powerful effect, and even though I don't advise taking it, I want to see it work and I want to see it do well. It is also worth noting that Overwhelming Splendor combined with Protection of the Heckma makes you pretty much impervious to combat damage, but I don't suggest taking bad cards to combo off with. Just something I thought you would like to know. All right, another card here, Jiro's Renunciation. I thought about giving this just a 0 straight up because I think it's bad, but cycling kind of pulls it out of the water there. It's 1 and a white for an instant, a common. Tap up to 2 target creatures. You can cycle it for 1 white mana. So this looks like a defensive card where you could tap 2 creatures down and save yourself some damage. If you're using it that way, you're going to lose the game, right? It's like decision paralysis. Just tapping your opponent's creatures for no additional effect is not going to get you anywhere. You have to be taking advantage of that, which makes this an aggro card. If you can use this aggressively, you can really just do tons of damage. If you get a huge start on your opponent, get a bunch of damage in, they finally stabilize with some blockers, you can use this to kind of push in even more damage by taking their blockers out of the equation. And it supports this theme that red-white has of kind of locking down blockers. You'll see a lot of ways to get around blockers in red-white specifically. I think this card's bad and you don't want it unless you are completely aggro. And even then, you could probably do better than this effect. But since it cycles, it's not terrible. You could put it in your deck. It cycles cheaply. 1 mana cyclers are pretty good. And that's about all I have to say. Don't play it unless you're very aggro. Don't try to play it defensively. And try to find something else before you go running this in the first place. All right, we're moving on to our 3s now. These are cards that I'll put in my deck, but I'm very sad to do so. The first one is Dutiful Servants. And hey, I see what you did there. Those who serve for 1 extra mana gets 1 extra toughness. It's really interesting how much 1 extra mana really affects a card, right? Those who serve is actually pretty decent. You're getting 6 total power and toughness for 3 mana, which is, on par with like a 3/3 for 3. Whereas Dutiful Servants somehow doesn't meet the bar. And it's interesting because it's only 1 more mana. Now, it is a zombie. They're both zombies, but Dutiful Servants just isn't good. Again, it's a blocker type creature, but it's going to get run over, especially by the time you get to 4 mana. The one thing that it does have going for it, and you'll hear me mention this a lot, especially when we get to the black creatures, is that it's a zombie. And Black-White Zombies is a real deck with a lot of extra support, plus the original support from the 1 pack of Amonkhet you're going to be drafting. So keep that in mind. Zombies are not something you can just completely shrug off. Even bad zombies have a place in certain decks. And there are a lot of 4-drops, which Amonkhet was kind of missing when it came to zombies. I think Dutiful Servants is the type of zombie that you're not looking to play, but if you are trying to meet a certain quota on how many zombies you have in your deck, it could fill its role. I think as far as 4-drops go, you could do better with something like Spar and Mummy, and that card's not even especially good. I just think Dutiful Servants is very weak, and the only reason you would play it is if you need a zombie in your deck. Moving on, Steadfast Sentinel. This is the first Eternalized card, which is basically an upgrade to Embalm, where you can embalm the creature, but it comes back as a 4/4 instead of its base stats. Steadfast Sentinel is basically a copy of Aether Inspector, right? A 2/3 Vigilance for 4, which in my opinion is a very, very bad card. 2/3 for 3 is already a bad card. Vigilance is not worth an extra mana. Vigilance is not that good on a card that doesn't particularly attack or block very well. So the power here is in Eternalize, which makes this come back as a 4/4 Vigilance, which is an okay card. A 4/4 Vigilance attacks and blocks well, but not for 6 mana. 6 mana is a lot for that, and I understand that this is a 2-for-1, like all Eternalized creatures are, but I think if you're including a bad card on the front side in order to get a decent card on the back side, you're doing yourself a little bit of a disservice. I think this card is just bad. And I'll say this again with a couple of the other Eternalized creatures. It's a liability. If your goal is to get the 4/4 Vigilance, it's a complete liability to put the front side of this card or the non-Eternalized side of this card in your deck. Steadfast Sentinel won't even trade for a lot of creatures at 4 mana, and it's just going to get run over very early. It doesn't attack particularly well at 2 power, and the Eternalized version isn't super busted or anything. It's just an okay card. 4/4 Vigilance for 6 is not something you would run in your deck all the time as is, so you're not getting a huge benefit out of Eternalizing this. It is a 2-for-1. It is a little bit of extra advantage, but you can do better. Next up, we'll go ahead and talk about Disposal Mummy, a 2/3 for 3, which is okay. You'll hear me say this about a lot of 3/2s and 2/3s for 3 mana, that they're okay cards, but you want them to do something relevant before you're happy to include it in your deck. Disposal Mummy exiles a target card from an opponent's graveyard when it enters the battlefield, which is kind of awkward on a 3 mana creature. A lot of times you'll want to play this on curve, you'll want to play it on turn 3, and your opponent just won't have anything you want to exile in the graveyard. But the real appeal of playing this card is sniping a card from your opponent's graveyard, something with Eternalize or Aftermath or something along those lines. But if you play it on turn 3, that's just not going to happen. And if you play it later in the game where that could happen, it's just not a particularly good body. So this is basically a sideboard card that you could include in your main deck if you want to, but I don't think it's worth doing so, and it's very replaceable. There are also plenty of other ways to exile cards from an opponent's graveyard without including a mediocre body in your deck. Next card on my list, unfortunately another rare here, Jeru with Eyes No Longer Shut, is 3 and double white for a 4/3 legendary human warrior at rare with vigilance and a bunch of other text that doesn't really matter. There's this long line of Planeswalker cards that reference Planeswalkers and take up a rare slot in your pack and make you really disappointed when you open them. Jeru can search for a Planeswalker when he enters the battlefield, and it reduces the amount of damage that's done to Planeswalkers you control. But unless you're really, really lucky, it's not going to be relevant most of the time. So really what you're looking at here is 5 mana for 4/3 vigilance, which isn't going to cut it. The only time I would play Jeru is if I really, really need a body in my deck. And you can wheel this card very easily if you need to, especially in a competitive set, and nobody's going to be playing this card. The body's just very bad. 5 mana for a 3 toughness creature is just not great, which you'll hear me say again too. And the Planeswalker text just isn't going to be relevant. It's also worth noting there's only one white Planeswalker in all of Amonkhet block, and that's Gideon in the 1 pack of Amonkhet, which if you get these two together, then sure, go nuts. But even then, you draw the Gideon first, and Jeru just sits there. Vigilance, again, not worth extra mana. This card, not that good. Moving on to our 4s, just one card I want to mention here. Remember that the archetypal filler cards are cards that in the average deck aren't going to be super good, but in specific kinds of decks are going to be very good. Unconventional Tactics is one of those cards. It's 3 mana for an uncommon sorcery. Target creature gets +3/+3 and fly-in until end of turn. And whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay a white mana to return Unconventional Tactics from your graveyard to your hand. Now, as is in an average deck, this can push in a lot of damage. It's kind of like a Mighty Leap, a little bit stronger for a little bit more mana, but at sorcery speed, it's not really what you want. If this was an instant, I'd be a little more excited about it in the average deck, but at sorcery speed, I'm just not feeling it. Yes, it can push in a lot of damage, but the real appeal here is getting it back over and over again in a zombie deck. In a deck that's committed to zombies, this is just a win condition all in itself. It can deal 6, 9, 12 damage over the course of the game, and it's very cheap to get back. It does work with eternalized creatures in just normal white decks, and white decks do have a larger than average number of eternalized and embalmed creatures. But a lot of times when you pay the embalm costs or the eternalized costs, you won't have extra mana floating around. It usually uses all of your mana for the turn. So I would save this for the most committed zombie decks. In a deck with, I don't know, 9, 10 plus zombies, this is a win condition, and it will win you a good number of games. Zombies are already pretty aggressive, so being able to jump them and give them +3/+3 over and over again throughout a game seems like a legit way to close the game out over time. I think this card's good. I would probably play it in a good number of non-zombie decks, even if I had just a couple zombies floating around. And in a very committed zombie deck, I think this card goes up to something like a 7 or 8. All right, now we're moving into our average filler, our 5s, cards that are okay. These are cards that you're not disappointed to put in your deck, but they're also not something you're picking very highly. The first one is Saving Grace, and I think this card has the potential to be much lower or much higher depending on the circumstances, so I put it as an average card until I see how it really plays out. Now, Saving Grace, first off, I don't know who Grace is and why we have to save her, but so be it. 1 in a white for an aura with Flash at uncommon. It enchants only creatures you control, and when it enters the battlefield, all damage that's dealt to you or permanents you control is dealt to the enchanted creature instead for the turn. The enchanted creature also gets +0/+3, so it gets a huge toughness boost and it redirects all damage to it for the turn. Now, this does a lot of cool things. It can eat a removal spell like Open Fire from your opponent on a creature that they weren't expecting to target, which is pretty nice for 2 mana. It can also fog a combat. It's basically sacrifice a creature, prevent all damage your opponent deals to you and permanents you control for the turn. Assuming that your opponent's dealing enough combat damage that it actually kills the creature, sometimes the 3 toughness will be enough that the redirected damage won't actually kill the enchanted creature, meaning you get to keep it around. And sometimes you can just blow your opponent out. It only prevents damage that your opponent does. It doesn't prevent damage that you do, which is pretty crazy. There are some really large situations, some really large board states where a bunch of creatures are getting in combat with each other, and Save and Grace can fog all of your opponent's creatures without fogging your creatures, meaning that you still get to kill off a bunch of their stuff without taking any damage. It's really, really nice against cards like Overcome and cards that just win the game on the spot. Trial of Solidarity, these go wide cards that are meant to be finishers. It's a good way to kind of absorb all that damage and put it on a single creature. It absorbs trample damage too, which is pretty nice. So I do like this card. I like the potential it has to blow your opponent out, but I'm a little skeptical on how often it'll work and how good it'll be when it does work. So we're going to go and put it on the average grade right now, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it jump up to 7 or 8. Next up on our list is Aven of Enduring Hope, a pretty simple card. 5 mana, 4 and a white for a common 3/3 bird cleric with flying, and you gain 3 life when it enters the battlefield. I don't think you'll ever be disappointed to tap out for this creature, and it's a decent body. It can close out a game. 3/3 flyer for 5 is pretty gold standard when it comes to flyers for limited, at least at common and uncommon. So getting the 3 extra life on top of an okay body is pretty good. I think 3 toughness creatures are a little bit of a liability in this format, since there are cards like Open Fire and Torment of Venom which deal with 3 mana or 3 toughness creatures very easily. But this does give you a little bit of a nice life buffer. I wouldn't go crazy. I would probably always play at least one of these in my white deck, but I wouldn't go too far over that since it is a little expensive in an aggressive format. But I do like the card, and I think it's perfectly playable. Next up is Active Heroism. 1 and a white for an instant at common that says untap target creature. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn and can block an additional creature this turn. The least likely part to matter here is block an additional creature, which does come up sometimes and can really ambush an opponent out of nowhere when they're not expecting it. But as is, you're looking at untap a creature, get +2/+2 per the turn, meaning you can use this defensively and aggressively, which is pretty nice. Obviously, it combos with Exert creatures pretty nicely because it untaps, which those type of effects just play out very well in general. And the +2/+2 makes it kind of an average combat trick. This is probably a little bit better than something like Mighty Leap, which is just, dead average for a combat trick. It will save your creature a lot. It'll trade up in combat a lot, and the additional block will come up occasionally. But as a combat trick, I like this just as an average card that I would probably include at least one of in most of my decks. Solitaire Camel is next on this list, still what I consider a pretty average card. It is 2 and a white for a common camel creature. It is a 3/2, and it has lifelink as long as you control a desert or there's a desert in your graveyard. From what I can tell, it's not too hard to get a desert in your deck. It's not too hard to get 3 or 4 deserts in your deck if you really want them. So if you draft a card like Solitaire Camel, you don't have to really prioritize deserts highly. You should be able to pick 1 or 2 up pretty easily. This isn't a huge upgrade. If you do get a desert, a 3/2 lifelink for 3 is a card that you're going to play very often anyway. So it is upside to have lifelink, but without lifelink, this is still just an average card. 3 mana, 3/2, not impressive, but a card you'll play some number of the time just to fill your curve out. I don't think this card is anything I would clamor for very highly. It's not like it particularly blocks or attacks super well. It's just an efficient creature that you can play for 3 mana, so I give it the average grade. All right, now we're moving into cards that I am excited about. All of these I do consider better than the cards that we've so far seen. The first is Dauntless Aven, starting off our 6s, our low priority playables. Remember, these are cards that I think are very good, and I'd be happy to include in my deck, but I'm not trying to pick them in my first couple of picks. I want to pick them up after, say, the first 3 cards in the pack. Dauntless Aven is 2 and a white for a 2/1 common bird warrior with flying, and whenever it attacks, you untap target creature you control. So at its worst, this untaps itself, giving it kind of vigilance, making it a 2/1 vigilant flyer for 3. And a 2 power flyer for 3 mana is an okay card as is. You'll play that pretty much all the time. Where this gets really nice is when you're untapping your own exert creatures, letting you just exert turn after turn, getting some sort of value. Some of the exert cards in this set are just absolutely nuts, and being able to use them turn after turn rather than every other turn is just going to kill your opponent very quickly. I think this card is good, and it is the first card that I want to mention here with 1 toughness. There are a lot of ways to pick off 1 toughness creatures in this format, so it's not like this is some bomb common or anything like that. It's just a good card you'll include in most of your decks, but beware for the things that can snipe this off, things like Banewhip, Punisher, and Borer of Blades, cards that we'll talk about later in the review. So don't worry too much about this. This card will play out well most of the time you play it, and it should actually pull its weight very nicely if you have exert creatures lying around. Without those, it's still a decent card, which leads me to believe that it's slightly better than the average filler card. Next up for our 6s is Sandblast, a reprint from, I believe, Fate Reforged, maybe Khans of Tarkir. It's 2 and a white for a common instant, deals 5 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Basically a not strictly, but a better upgrade to Impeccable Timing, which is 3 damage for 2 mana. Now, Sandblast deals 5, which is enough to kill almost anything that's not indestructible or prevents damage or something along those lines, which means it's a pretty good trick. A lot of people have already pointed out that, Sandblast is a little worse than you might think because white decks tend to be aggressive, and if you're attacking, your opponent has to have already declared blocks for this to be useful, meaning you can't use it to kind of push in extra damage. But I think it plays offense and defense well enough, and it kills enough creatures that you'll play it almost all the time. It is one of the only removal spells here in white as far as commons go, so you will take this a good number of times. I don't think Sandblast will wheel very often either. It's the type of card that you'll happily pick up 5th, 6th, 7th pick or something like that. Not really a sign that white is open, but a sign that, you can draft a couple more good white cards for your deck. Play it, don't go crazy on it, maybe 2 copies at most, but as far as removal spells go, you could do much worse than this, and you could actually do better as well. All right, next card we want to talk about here is Mummy Paramount. 1 and a white for a 2/2 zombie. It is a common, and it says whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, the Mummy Paramount gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I really like this card. The obvious comparison here is Binding Mummy. It's just a payoff for playing zombies at common, and having more common payoffs means that you're more likely to get cards that you really want to fill out your deck when you're playing zombies. Binding Mummy is a little bit better because it forces more creatures into the red zone by tapping your opponent's creatures down. But what Mummy Paramount does is turn more zombies into extra damage rather than more attacks. Which, either one, you can make a case for being better in certain situations. I think Mummy Paramount, while being a little worse than Binding Mummy, is still a perfectly solid card. Plays very, very well in the zombie deck and probably plays well in most decks anyway. As far as white decks go, if you want to be attacking, you'll play a good number of these, and you might have some random zombies laying around in your red deck. There are zombies in other colors besides white and black, which is pretty nice. I think Mummy Paramount's just a good card. I wouldn't pick it up super highly, even if I were in zombies. It's the type of card that a lot of other decks probably wouldn't want or probably wouldn't prioritize. So you might be able to wheel it, but I think it's a solid common, and it's a nice payoff for playing the zombie deck. Angel of the God Pharaoh, 4 and double white for a 4/4 uncommon angel creature with flying and cycling for 2 mana. Obviously, we look at a cycle and flyer like this, and the first thing we can compare it to is Winged Shepherd. I think Winged Shepherd is an alright card. I don't pick it highly, but it does cycle very, very cheaply, and 1 mana cyclers are pretty good. It's not the type of card I'm super excited to cast, but I will usually cast it, and sometimes it'll win the game, or sometimes it'll do enough damage with Vigilance, and it'll end up blocking at some point that I'm happy playing it, and I'm happy cycling it. Angel of the God Pharaoh, I think, is very similar. 2 mana cycling is a little bit worse than 1 mana cycling, but not by that much, not enough that you won't include this in your deck. I think this is kind of a weaker uncommon and somewhere along the power level of a really strong common, but a 4/4 flyer for 6 is a good card, and you'll play that almost all the time. It's a good a good finisher for white decks that are starting to get brick walled by your opponent. A lot of time, white decks can get in a lot of damage early, but if your opponent stabilizes, they have trouble closing out the game. So you need these flyers to kind of do that job for you. One extra thing I'll mention here is that I think 4 toughness creatures are going to have a better time than 3 toughness creatures. So I actually like the Angel a little bit more than the Winged Shepherd because it does dodge cards like Open Fire, which are commons in this set. And that gives it a slight notch above the Winged Shepherd, but not by that much. I think the card's perfectly playable. I'd be happy to have it, but I'm not picking it very highly. Now we're moving into our high priority playables. These are the type of cards that I'm looking to get maybe second, third, even fourth pick. These are cards that I'm happy if my opponent passes me if I'm in the colors. Oketra's Avenger is the first one, a card that makes it really hard for your opponent to block. It's 1 and a white for a 3/1 common human warrior creature. You may exert it when it attacks, and if you do, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to it this turn. So this is one of a group of aggressive low drop 2-mana creatures that can just jam in turn after turn. Well, every other turn in most cases. Just being able to attack as a 3/1 on its own is already okay. If your opponent doesn't play a creature on turn 2, you just get to deal 3 damage anyway without exerting this, which is pretty nice. That's the advantage of playing 3/1s for 2 mana in the first place, is that they just get in a lot of extra damage if your opponent can't keep up on board. If your opponent does play a blocker, you can just exert this and it probably gets past it anyway. If they're not playing one of those stupid O4s, this is going to attack past pretty much anything your opponent plays. Death touch creatures aren't going to stop it because of its ability to stop combat damage. Removal spells like Sandblast aren't going to do the trick, or Impeccable Timing. This is just going to be able to freely attack past pretty much anything your opponent can play on turn 2. It will get walled by a couple creatures, but not very many, and it makes it a super aggressive creature. Even in the late game, this can attack pretty nicely. It's very, very close to the power level of Gustwalker, just as far as being able to attack as a 3-power creature with some sort of evasion attached to it. I think the card is very solid. If I were playing white, I would look to pick this card very highly. Again, it's not the type of card I want to start my draft off with. I want to be white before I pick it. But once I know I'm in the color, I'm very happy to pick up Oketra's Avenger. Another 7 we have here is Scourge Champion. This might actually just be an 8 due to its cheap Eternalize cost. It costs 2 and a white to cast. It's 2/3, uncommon, human wizard, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain life equal to its power. So casting this for 3 mana, you'll gain 2 life, which is nice. A 2/3 4/3 that gains you 2 life is an okay card. Not a huge upgrade on a normal 2/3, but the extra life is welcome. The real power here is in the Eternalize cost, which is 2 and double white, 4 mana total, but you also have to discard a card as part of the cost. If you can turn that discard into any sort of advantage, then this card is bonkers. But as is, it's kind of annoying you have to discard a discard a card, but it does make up for the cheap Eternalize cost. So 4 mana, discard a card, bring this back as a 4/4, and then trigger its ability again, and you'll gain 4 life. Over the course of the game, you're going to gain 6 extra life off this creature, which is very, very nice. Makes it hard for your opponent to race. Makes it good in aggressive decks as well as kind of slower mid-rangey decks. And I think this card is just overall very good. It's the type of card that you're actually happy discarding to some sort of other effect because you can Eternalize it. And if you can ever curve this on turn 3 and trade it off for another creature and then Eternalize it on turn 4, you should be pretty far ahead. I think a 4/4 for 4 mana is going to be above curve in this set, and I think you'll be happy to play as many of this card as you can get. I could see myself first picking this, so maybe it should be an 8, but again, it is just a 3 mana 2/3 until you Eternalize it, which kind of bumped it down a notch for me. Vizier of the True is our next card. It's 3 and a white for a 3/2 uncommon human cleric creature. You may exert it as it attacks. Okay. And whenever you exert a creature, any creature at all, tap target creature an opponent controls. Remember earlier when I mentioned there are a lot of ways to just stop your opponent's blockers or get past them? Here's another way to do it. Maybe like the 3rd or 4th example of it in this set, in this review alone, just the white card. Vizier of the True is pretty solid. It reminds me of On-Crop Crusher. It's a way to exert a creature and get past a blocker. Obviously, it doesn't have haste. Obviously, it costs 1 more mana, but the stats are the same. You get the idea, right? The real power here is that you get to tap a creature an opponent controls whenever you exert any creature you control, not just Vizier of the True. So you can actually just use this, attack with it normally, and exert some other creature. Or if you have an exert creature the turn you play this, you can exert that right away and get a benefit off of this immediately. Notice it taps the creature. It doesn't stop it from blocking in the first place. So an untap effect might get you, but I think Vizier of the True is just going to play out very well. In an aggro deck, it's very good. I'd be happy to pick up multiples of this card. It's a type of card that I'm looking to pick up, maybe a white bomb rare in my first pick and then follow it up with something like Vizier of the True. And if I knew I wanted to be an aggro deck, I'd be very happy to play this. All right, Steward of Solidarity. Again, another card that could easily be an 8 here, but I'm going to go ahead and jump it down to 7 until I see it in action. Steward of Solidarity is 1 and a white for a 2/2 uncommon human warrior. Tap, exert it, create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with vigilance. Now, this is how you make a 2-drop. This is exactly what you're looking for in a 2-drop. It's good early. It can attack, it can block, it can do whatever you need to in the early game. And then at some point, your 2/2s always drop off, right? Your opponent plays a 2/3 or a 3/3, or the game has gone long and there's just a complicated board state, and your 2/2s just lose a lot of their value. Now, when your 2/2 gives you value in the late game, that's a hallmark of a good card, in my opinion. Being able to exert this basically for free, you don't have to pay any extra mana or anything like that, and just make a 1/1 every other turn is very, very good. It lets you go wide, it lets you outpace your opponent, it makes sure that you're at least at parity or you're able to go wider than your opponent. And this is the type of card that can break a board stall and take advantage of some sort of sweep and pump effect, some sort of anthem effect like Trial of Solidarity or something along those lines, Top Prop Elite, things along those lines, right? This is a very good card. It's probably a premier uncommon in the color. Might just be one of the best uncommons. I'd have to look through the entire set and give you my opinion about that, but I think this card is super solid, very strong, and you'd be happy to play as many of these as you can get. All right, now we're moving into our 8s, our strong first picks. These are cards I want to start my draft off with. A lot of times you'll see uncommons here. A lot of times you'll open some stupid rare, and you'll have to resort to your uncommons as your first pick. These are the type of cards that I'm happy to see in the pack if my rare is not very good. In this case, we have a mythic rare. Crested Sunmare is 3 and double white for a 5/5 horse and mythic. Other horses you control have indestructible, thumbs up. At the beginning of each end step, if you gain life this turn, create a 5/5 white horse creature token. Okay, well, this card kind of came out of nowhere for spoiler season, and I've had a lot of discussions with people about whether or not I think this is a bomb, but you can see it's an 8, right? Not a 9. Now, if you have lots of life gain in your deck, if you have multiple sources of life gain, this is a 9. If you have a ton of life gain, this is an easy 10, but without a lot of sources of life gain, if you have only 1 or 2, this is just a good card. It's a Colossopede. It's a vanilla 5/5 for 5, which is an okay card. You'll play that good number of the time. It's replaceable, but you'll play it. The real power here is in the ability. You have to get the tokens off of this if you want this to be an actual bomb. There are tons of ways to gain life, but most of them aren't very good, and I don't suggest running a bunch of bad ways to gain life. Some of these examples here on screen, just cards that I wouldn't recommend playing in the first place as ways to gain life. And your Sunmare is going to be fine enough on its own that you don't have to push it with cards like this. What you're looking for are lifelink creatures or things that, like Scourge Champion, or I don't know, there's some lands that gain life and things along those lines. Things that you're not disappointed to play if you don't draw your Sunmare or if your Sunmare is already dead. Things along those lines. One other thing to mention here is that it triggers on each end step, including your opponent's end step. So if you somehow have ways to gain life during your turn and your opponent's turn, you're just going to be able to go off and win the game very easily. It's also really nice that there are multiple sweepers in this set, and Crested Sunmare helps protect the tokens from the sweepers. If your opponent tries to destroy all creatures, and you have some indestructible horse tokens, those will actually survive. Although keep in mind, the tokens are only indestructible as long as you control the Sunmare. Once the Sunmare dies, those tokens are no longer indestructible, and they still die to Hour of Devastation, which, is a card in the set we'll talk about. But anyway, as is, this card is a bomb if you can support it with some life gain. If you can't, it's just an average card. Next up, speaking of sweepers, there are 3 rare sweepers in this set. Not to mention a couple other like mini sweeper type effects. And Amonkhet didn't really have that. You had Sweltering Suns, you had Rags to Riches, you had things like that, but not really Destroy All Creatures or something along those lines. And I'm a big fan of these type of cards because they get you out of situations that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get out of. Sometimes you fall so far behind in a match that no removal spell, no creature top deck is going to save you. And having access to an effect like this gives you an out that you otherwise wouldn't have in your deck. Now, our Revelation might be the weakest of the three. It's 3 and triple white, 6 mana total for a rare sorcery. It says it costs 3 colorless mana less to cast if there are 10 or more non-land permanents on the battlefield, and then it destroys all non-land permanents. So this wipes everything, artifacts, enchantments, anything crazy, all creatures, as long as they're not indestructible. Pretty much anything you can think of that's not a land. Planeswalkers, they're dead, they're gone. You reset the game. Now, I wouldn't be looking to that cost reduction very closely because a lot of times there aren't 10 permanents on the battlefield or 10 non-land permanents on the battlefield when it comes to a game of limited. Sometimes you'll be like 8 or 9 and you'll be sitting on 5 mana and you'll be like, God, I really wish there were more permanents, which means you have to commit some permanents of your own to the battlefield just to have them swept up. 6 mana is also a lot for a sweeper in general. Sometimes you can just die to this before you get to 6 mana. Sometimes you'll be stuck on 4 or 5 lands, and the cost reduction won't come up enough that I think you can rely on it. Not to mention this is triple white. You have to have 3 white mana in order to cast this in the first place, which can be a huge liability on your mana base, or not the type of card you would splash, not the type of card that you can play in just the average white deck. You have to be pretty heavy white to pull this off in time to cast it. But with all that being said, I do think this makes for a strong pick in a draft. Again, I don't think this is a huge bomb sweeper, which is reflected in the grade here, but I do think it's a card that you'll be happy to have access to. It's the type of card that I'm really happy to have in sealed because I know my opponent's going to have a lot of pressure. I know my opponent's going to have a lot of crazy stuff going on, and this is a clean answer to almost anything in the format you can think of, including planeswalkers, including busted enchantments and things like that. So our Revelation, not quite bomb status, but one of the 3 sweepers in this set, and a card that I'm very happy to have access to. Another 8 here, uncommon, as I mentioned, is Desert's Hold, 2 and a white for an uncommon aura. It enchants a creature, and it says when it enters the battlefield, if you control a desert or there's a desert in your graveyard, you gain 3 life. And then the enchanted creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. So this is basically a rest, and we saw a pseudo-rest or pacifism effect in compulsory rest, which I thought was pretty good. Some people seem to be down on it, but I thought it was a really good card. Pacifisms are usually really good and limited, and arrests are even better than that. And for those of you wondering, arrest just means a pacifism that stops your opponent from using activated abilities. There are some cards with decent activated abilities, especially some of the tapped exert creatures like Angel. Well, spoiler alert, we won't mention that one yet. And I think this is pretty good. Notice that Desert's Hold is also a decent way of dealing with some of the gods, even though it doesn't stop their passive abilities, but it does stop them from being relevant in combat, and it does stop their pretty busted activated abilities when we get to talking about those cards. The 3 life on top of that is really nice, makes it a good addition for pretty much any deck. It's good against aggro, it's good against control, it's good against anything that's going to play a creature at any point that you might need to deal with. It's essentially a removal spell. If you're looking for removal in white, these are your go-to cards, and they're usually pretty high picks. I would be happy to start my draft off with Desert's Hold, and I wouldn't get too far out of my way to get a desert, but with 1 or 2 in my deck, I'd be even happier with it. Now we're talking bombs. There are just a couple I want to talk here, and again, there are no 10s, but there are a couple 9s. There are going to be 2 cards in the bomb category. The first, I think, is a Dorn Pouncer, and this is kind of an inconspicuous card. A lot of people might look at it and not think it's a bomb, but I think the Eternalize goes a long way in making this a card that I'm very, very happy to first pick. A Dorn Pouncer is 1 and a white for a 1/1 rare cat creature. It is double striker, and it has Eternalize for 5 for 3 and double white. So on its surface, it's 2 mana for a 1/1 double strike, which isn't insane, but is basically an on-curve creature. It's the equivalent of something like a 2/2, or at least it trades with other 2/2s and 3/2s because of double strike. It also makes it very good with auras that pump its power or equipment, things along those lines. Cards that you're probably not playing anyway, but if you happen to have them, they go a long way towards making this even better. Now, where Adorned Pouncer gets really good is in the Eternalized cost. First off, it's fairly cheap. It's 5 mana instead of the standard 6 that you'll see on a lot of commons and uncommons here. For 5 mana, you're getting a 4/4 Double Striker out of your graveyard. And a 4/4 Double Striker, I don't think I really need to tell you, is a very strong card. Think about like Oketra without the stipulation on attacking or blocking. Obviously, no activated ability to make tokens, but you get the point, right? Just a super powerful Double Striker. 8 damage per attack. It usually eats up anything that blocks it. It just laughs in the face of death touch creatures because of double strike, and it just beats your opponent down super hard. It's very hard for your opponent to keep up with it, and they're going to have removal spell to deal with it. Adorned Pouncer is the type of card that I might sideboard in Graveyard Hate for, just because it is such an efficient, powerful threat when you eternalize it. And it is the type of card that I'm very happy to have exile and effects for in the first place. Things like Magma Spray and Puncture and Blow, cards that we'll see later on, Hour of Glory, stuff like that. I think Adorned Pouncer is a very strong card. I do believe it is a bomb, and I would be happy to start a draft off with it. I cannot see myself passing this for a lot of uncommons in this set. And our final white card today, what I consider to be at least the best white card in the set, probably somewhere in the top 5 cards in the set total. Well, maybe top 10, just because the power level on the rares in this set are pretty crazy. But that card is Angel of Condemnation. It's a very, very strong card. So first off, it's 2 and double white for a 3/3 rare angel creature. It has Flying and Vigilance, which are both good abilities on a 4 mana 3/3. It has 2 tap abilities. The first one says 2 and a white, tap it, exile a target creature, another target creature, and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. And 2 and a white to tap it and exert it, exile another target creature until Angel of Condemnation leaves the battlefield. So a lot to talk about here. First off, without the abilities, it's already a very good card. A Vigilant 3/3 flyer for 4 mana is a strong card, and Vigilance also works very, very nicely with the Exert ability here, or the first tap ability for that matter. The first ability you're not going to use as often, but it does come in hand and very nicely. It can stop an attacker. It can take a blocker out of the battlefield. It can kill a token. It can reset a creature with +1/+1 counters. It can also even take control of something that's been stolen from you, maybe with Lay Claim or Kefnet's Last Word or something along those lines. It's a very versatile ability, and I always rave about these type of cards with blink effects, things like Eldrazi Displacer, when it comes to limited, because they are so versatile that they just make for very, very powerful cards. And this isn't really a card that you're paying a premium for. You're only paying 4 mana and you're getting such a powerful ability. Now, the second ability is where the real meat of this is and makes it a huge bomb. Being able to exert this and just exile your opponent's best creature is ridiculous. The fact that you can attack with it first and then exert it before blocks is also pretty insane. And if you back this up with any sort of untap effect, maybe something like Dauntless Aven, you are hands down just going to win that game, no doubt about it. Just exiling your opponent's best creature every other turn is insane. Your opponent can't keep up with this, which means Angel of Condemnation needs to eat a removal spell or it will win the game. It's just a huge card like that. Now, why is this a 9 instead of a 10? 2 reasons. First off, it's a 3 toughness creature, and that's going to be pretty easy to kill in this format, I think. There are a lot of times that your opponent will just have something like Ambuscade or Open Fire or Torment of Venom. You can name all the cards that this dies to. And yes, dies to removal is a bad argument, but it does make the second ability very risky. There are a lot of times you'll exile 2, 3 creatures, and then when your opponent finally does remove this, they get all their creatures back, which is why I think people really overrate those Banisher Priest type effects where you get to exile something until it leaves the battlefield, because they do have an out to get their thing back. It's not a solid removal spell, and by the time they kill it, you didn't really 2-for-1 them or anything like that. They got their creature back and you're just down a card. Now, that being said, that doesn't really detract from the power of Angel of Condemnation. It's just an insanely powerful card. I had the pleasure of playing with this at a pre-release, and it was insane. It just straight up won me the games that it stuck in, even though it died most of the times I played it. And that's fair. It's a lightning rod creature. If you don't remove it right away, it wins the game, and that's what you want in your first pick. It is double white. which will be a little annoying some amount of the time, but it's not a huge consideration. Just first pick this card anytime you see it. In fact, move into white if you do see it. It's an exceptionally powerful card. Definitely the best white card in the set as far as I'm concerned. And whether you agree or disagree with that, I think the card's insane. But yeah, Angel of Condemnation definitely has the thumbs up from me as best white card in this set due to its pretty insane exert ability. Now, that being said, that's going to go ahead and cover all of the white cards for us today. I think there are 28 white cards. Keep in mind, it's a small set. But yeah, thanks for watching. If you're still here, go and leave a comment or a like or thumbs up or something like that. Or tell me what cards you think I'm under or over evaluated, and tell me what cards overperformed for you or really disappointed you at your pre-releases. Or if you've done any drafts, let me know about those too. I will be looking at the blue cards next, and we'll just go in Wooborg order. And then we'll be finishing up with lands, artifacts, yada, 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 multicolor cards, all that good stuff. So thank you guys for watching. My name's Timothy, and I will see y'all next time.